and lunches together and breakfast together. And here we do a lot of tea breaks. And so, mixing it up a bit, guys, and just being a little natural. I mean, there are people whose, dogs are skipping behind them and kids. I mean, just keeping it. I go back to just keeping it real and keeping it. I mean, that's the humanity of it. Whereas in your regular workplace, you're not going to have your family trotting behind you and, your animals hopping around. Like going outside, I encourage everyone, if you have connectivity, go outside. But wherever you are, get some fresh air.
That ain't going to work here in Seattle, Sydney, but not this time of year, but it's a great idea. Listen, I want to thank you for joining us. I hope you'll come back on the real podcast and we'll go a little bit deeper. There's a lot I want to talk to you about in terms of what you're planning next and your reflections on career so far. So thanks for sharing with us.
Thank you, Chris. Really appreciate it. Thank you, Anne, as well. Appreciate everyone.
Dr. Sydney Savion, thank you so much.
Thanks.
In the second part of our discussion, which was recorded a week later, Dr. Sydney Savion agreed to go a little bit deeper on some of the conversations that we'd started in the HR Innovation and TechFest conference. As we drop into that conversation, she's describing to me how she and Air New Zealand responded to the COVID crisis using a framework that she calls Survive, Revive and Thrive, and how they work to keep their staff employed. We also talk about the future of L&D, her leadership philosophy, the amazing Prime Minister of New Zealand, and how L&D might improve on our poor track record of making impact around diversity and inclusion, despite years and years of trying.
We partnered with these companies in terms of identifying skills that they needed to help transition others that were exiting Air New Zealand, transition to some other opportunities, whether it's educational opportunities or other business opportunities. And even if it wasn't like for like, at least from my experience, what most people wanted is they wanted to know that their livelihood was protected in some way. Maybe it's not going to be equal. Maybe it's not the same job. Maybe it's not even a similar job, but they're thinking about, keeping food on the table, keeping their lights on at their home, keeping their home. Those are the, building the partnership with external entities outside of Air New Zealand to help shepherd our people to a reasonably soft landing. That's like the survive mode. And then revive really is, okay, now that we've, gotten the workforce in the state that we need it, what are the things we need to do to start to return to that and get the company stabilized, if you will, and the culture stabilized. And so what we found here is that, of course, since we're contained in our national bubble here, is that the national demand for flights to explore New Zealand has increased. In fact, it's more than what we imagined, quite frankly, because the way the holiday system works here in New Zealand, right now we're in summer, we're practically overbooked now. And so that's what's been giving us, one, hope, and two, keeping the airline in the state of, some kind of stability, if you will, and giving us time to work on, okay, what's the thrive mode? So as it relates to learning in this revive mode, it's still focusing on the critical regulatory training, but also now starting to move back into what specifically do our leaders need at this time to start to reset their thinking about, the next chapter in this company's history. And so that's the thrive. What does thrive look like? And I think that still, we have a plan, but changes in, every day right now. I'll say in Australia, there's been a new outbreak. So where we've been as a nation, the government and the airline working with Australia to figure out how do we create this Australasia bubble. Well, now something now has been kind of set back in a way until Australia figures out what's going on with the outbreak now.
Got it. It may be that those kind of three things, survive, revive, and thrive, are not sequential, right? It may be that they overlap to some extent. There's three sets of work that may be going on in parallel. That's what I was thinking about that frame.
Yes, and you think about, in this case, given COVID, it's almost, like one step forward, two steps back when you have these situations with these outbreaks, because these are things you can't control. I mean, you can control, right? And we've done a really good job in New Zealand, but you have to really put some tight restrictions in place in order to accomplish what we've been able to accomplish here in New Zealand.
How do you think about, lots of L&D teams that I'm working with are starting to rethink what their role is, given what's happened and given the opportunity that's created in the future. How do you think that the role of L&D will change in the future? Do you think there are things we can learn from this particular crisis?
Chris, I hope so. I'm hopeful. I really am hopeful. And one of the things I hope people have discovered, again, not every company will have been in this place like a airline, like Air New Zealand, where we really were in a survival mode. So, we had a lot of painful lessons that we're trying to glean from and do better. But one, making learning business critical or strategic business asset. That's one thing. Hopefully, people and companies have learned. Make learning a strategic business asset. Two, identify business critical skills and ensure that people are sharp on more than one skill. So other than the thing you hired them for, what other talent or skills do they have that can support a business critical situation? I mean, the unknowns. And then the third thing for me is business continuity. Oftentimes it's focused on the supply chain, your assets, your infrastructure. Very few business continuity plans actually have learning in there, or training, if you will. Yeah, learning gets to review it, but when the chips are down, how are you using learning? It should not be an afterthought. And the fourth thing, which I hate to use an even number here, but is understanding your digital tech stack and making sure it works in the environment. The fact that a lot of companies had to fumble around to figure out, what technology worked, and coming to realize all that old legacy technology wasn't necessarily working out in those rural areas. So it's great when people can come into the office, but when they can't, how are you dealing with that? So understanding those things. So your tech stack, business continuity, making learning a business strategic asset, and understanding those business critical skills.
Well, let's hope that people are learning those lessons for sure. You mentioned the extraordinary leadership in New Zealand. I think you did. If you didn't, I'll mention it. The New Zealand Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, has done an extraordinary job, I think, and really has a different approach to leadership. There's certainly not a lot of other countries can boast such incredible and sort of different kind of leadership. In your LinkedIn profile, you say that you have an avant-garde approach to attracting, developing, retaining, and empowering talent. I really love that. But what do you mean by avant-garde, and what is your philosophy around leadership in general?
My philosophy around leadership is, one, it's beginning with empathy. And I believe that our Prime Minister has done that, and kindness. And no one on this episode should mistake kindness for weakness, because I believe this Prime Minister has also demonstrated and exhibited strength and resolve as well. And so the two can work in concert. And so that's part of my philosophy. The other part of my philosophy is excellence. I believe in being excellent, and that's relative to each individual. But best effort is what I would say. Best effort or perfect effort. And giving people the opportunity to experiment. I'm a big, big believer in calculated risk. So therefore that experimentation. So allowing people the freedom to do that, and allowing people, and that allows people an opportunity to fail, to safely fail, and learn from those failings, and then figure out how to get back up and, try again. So that, I would say, is my general philosophy in leadership.
there's a lot of conversation around like soft skills were undervalued. I think over the last couple of years, there's been a real trend towards investing more heavily in those soft skills like leadership, collaboration, empathy, those kind of traits, the traits that your prime minister exhibits very well. But also our job as L&D people is not just to create great human skills, but also to get sort of technical skills in place. A lot of time is spent teaching people to fly airplanes safely or write code effectively or so on and so forth. Did you have a philosophy on how you balance the time and the effort that you spent on those two things, or do you just see them as all one thing?
I don't see them as all one thing, but I didn't have a real formula. And the reason I say that is because I think it's individual. I believe that certain people innately have this empathetic nature, and whether it's because it was cultivated in them as a child or over time they developed it. And then there are people who don't. There are people quite awkward in demonstrating or exhibiting that kind of behavior, if you will. That's why I think you need to have individual development plans, and it needs to be tailored and personalized to the individual. You can look around and, using our prime minister as an example, and she's probably more popular in the U.S., but the world sees that empathy and kindness. When people talk about her, that's what they talk about. Amazing. She's sympathetic. She's kind. She's also a strong leader. But then there are other leaders, you would not necessarily tag them with empathetic or kind, right? For some, it's innate and developed, and for some, it's not so much, and you have to somewhat develop it. And I think it's an individual thing. So I do not believe that, the leadership or soft skills and technical skills are the same. With technical skills, there are people that are gifted in code. It's just natural because it's something that was incubated or cultivated, being young, and they're younger leaders. And so they're really good at that. So we probably don't need to spend a lot of time on that with them. That we need to focus on these other things. And Chris, it all depends on what the individual wants and what the company needs, because every person doesn't want the same thing. So that's why also I'm a big believer in trying to the best of your ability as a company or as a learning leader to figure out how do you manage that individual. It's a difference between being at a company with 12,500 or 6,000 people, company with 100,000 people like Dell Technologies, right? So when you talk about individual, personalized, you really have to be very intentional the bigger the company gets to manage that balance.
You have done quite a bit of work on D&I, as many learning leaders have in organizations. And I think you've just started a position as an advisor on D&I at the American Chamber of Commerce in New Zealand. You can correct me on that if I'm wrong. But as a sort of profession, as a discipline, we've been delivering a portfolio of programs to help organizations understand things like unconscious bias and recognize the value of diversity of opinion and work styles. But here in the US, at least, it's become sort of clear that we've not made enough progress. And one of the amazing things that happened in 2020, the many amazing things that happened in 2020 was people had the time and took the time to sort of voice their disquiet about a set of injustices and inequities that seem to be, how should I say, almost, systematic. And it's caused me to reflect a lot on the many times that I've built programs like this, taught behaviors and skills that were not really reinforced by the systems that we put people back into after we'd finished the training. How can L&D practitioners and leaders improve on this track record? Do you have a point of view on that?
Wow, this is a big question. And I agree with you, Chris. I don't think we've made the progress. And not only don't I think it's been proven that over the past 60 years, we haven't really seen the meaningful evidence of this concept of diversity and inclusion. In fact, there's a recent study out that shows that the workplaces in the United States are even more segregated than they were, 40 years ago. And then, of course, you take that with the movements happening, whether it's Black Lives Matter, Me Too, and all these other movements, social equality movements happening. goes to show, yes,